Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is June 12th, 2014, and my guest is Lars Peter Hansen of the University of Chicago. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2013. Lars, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you. It's my privilege.
Our topic for today is measurement in the face of uncertainty, drawing on a paper you wrote last year on systemic risk and your Nobel Prize lecture. Along the way, we'll deal with some issues that have come up on EconTalk dealing with measurement and the scientific nature of economics, if it is scientific. You opened the paper early on with a quote from Sir William Thomson, also known as Lord Kelvin. I'm going to read the entire quote. "I often say that when you can measure something that you're speaking about, express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of the meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the stage of science, whatever the matter might be." Close quote. And as I mentioned recently in an episode, and as you mentioned in your paper, it's carved in stone in the Social Science Research Building at the University of Chicago. It is hard to deny the truth of that quote. What is your perspective?
So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that economics at the end of the day should aim to be quantitative, and that should be our ambition. But we need to be quantitative in a sensible way. So by quantitative, I certainly mean the fact that we should be able to use economic analysis to build models, and these models should help us guide policy. These are models, but that should be connected to empirical evidence. Now, there's a challenge with all this perspective, and that's the following. This is true of all models. Models are always wrong. I mean, I'd say it seems kind of strange to hear that initially, but there's a sense in which models are simplifications, they're abstractions, and they're wrong. And it's always a challenge to try to assess are they kind of wrong in ways that are essential or inessential and the like. And so whenever you have these quantitative ambitions, you have to also recognize that the limitations of the models, and often that's the hardest part of the challenge.
And in the area of systemic risk, which is a term that's been used a lot recently related to the financial sector, the crisis of 2008, the issue of too big to fail, how are we doing on measuring systemic risk and quantifying it? Yeah.
So I think we're at the very primitive stages. I'm certainly happy to that being an example where our knowledge probably is still quite meager. There's the term systemic risk really was not on people's radar screen prior to the financial crisis, and it only became a topic of conversation among academics and policymakers prominently after the financial crisis. Now, systemic risk it's had a little bit of a danger of being a buzzword. I'm reminded, some people poke fun when I say this, but I'm reminded of a quote by Justice Potter Stewart about pornography, that you kind of know it when you see it, and he wasn't going to really kind of go and give you the formal, rigorous definition of it. And there's been a little bit of that aspect of this term systemic risk. It's because of financial regulation like Dodd-Frank. We think that it's become kind of the code word or mandate for how we should be looking at the financial sector. But the problem is that we are still, from a formal economic standpoint, learning about it, trying to understand it. There's a variety of different models that are trying to capture it. It's in a quantitative fashion. I think we just barely scratched the surface.
What worries me about it is it could be like Bigfoot, rumored to exist, but hard to verify. So it is a buzzword, but it strikes me it's a buzzword that was invoked to justify policy ex post And we don't really have any idea whether that policy was justified or not. The bailouts, the TARP, and other policies were done because we had to. It was alleged. It was alleged that we had to because without it, there'd be this massive domino effect. Do you think we have any evidence that that's true?
Yeah, that's a really open question. Somehow we didn't run the counterfactual about suppose we didn't do X, didn't take these steps, what would have happened? There was big fear that very, very bad things would have happened. Do we know that for sure? And the like. I think it's a tremendously important question, and I think it's one that remains open. Let me just take a step back. If we look at the recession, the Depression in the United States, it really took us a very, very long time to get firm understanding of what of the various different explanations and why the recoveries were slow and what triggered it and the like. And I suspect the same is going to be going on as we try to understand exactly what the important forces were in this financial crisis. But there's lots of interesting conjectures out there, but we don't know for sure. And back to this concept of systemic risk, if you go and you read some work that comes out of people like Andy Haldane of the Bank of England. I find Andy Haldane of the Bank of England has been the principal in terms of looking at financial oversight there, but he's written very, very openly about our lack of knowledge, and the lack of knowledge and understanding of concepts like this make financial oversight and regulation challenging. I remember that right after the financial crisis, I went to many conferences that would bring together academics and people from research departments inside various different central banks to try to talk about financial oversight going forward. And a couple of type of observations really struck me at that time, and it was that this is a very complicated problem. And therefore, it requires a complicated solution. And I kind of thought to myself, and I would agree that this could be a very, very complicated problem, and that we're still trying to understand it. But complicated problems in the face of limited knowledge don't obviously lead to complicated solutions, because the solution itself can add additional uncertainty and can be counterproductive. It can be overreacting to false knowledge, and that can be harmful.
Yeah, it also allows for the possibility of regulatory capture lost in the details, which is the thing I worry a lot about. I'm going to read a lengthy quote. Lengthy, it's about a paragraph, where you talk about this issue, which I thought was extremely apt. You said, and this is from that paper, the systemic risk paper of 2013, quote, "What is at stake here is more than just a task for statisticians. Even though policy challenges may appear to be complicated, it does not follow that policy design should be complicated. Acknowledging or confronting gaps in modeling has long been conjectured to have important implications for economic policy. As an analogy, I recall Friedman's 1960s argument for a simplified approach to the design of monetary policy. His policy prescription was premised on the notion of long and variable lags in a monetary transmission mechanism that was too poorly understood to exploit formally in the design of policy. His perspective was that the gaps in our knowledge of this mechanism were sufficient, that premising activist monetary policy on incomplete models could be harmful." So talk about that again, because I think it's such a crucial insight into good public policy.
Yeah, so as I stated at the outset of this interview, at the end of the day, I'm a model builder, and so I that's what I kind of do in my academic career. But I want to do this in ways that are kind of very useful. Now, one can do the following: one can go out there and build some mathematical model. You can produce some wonderful mathematical equations. You can kind of do some rigorous analysis of that given model, and you can even generate beautiful computer output from it. And that can all
and get a good publication out of it.
You certainly get publications out of it as well.
Yeah.
The thing is that just because you've written it down as a formal mathematical model, and I'm also big on mathematics because I think it adds clarity between mapping of assumptions to conclusions. That alone doesn't mean that it's right, and that alone doesn't mean that you should have 100% confidence in it, and you shouldn't just look to this formal apparatus to say, see, it's nice and formal, therefore we should have confidence in it. And that's why this... And so I kind of think of Friedman as saying, well, people are writing down these models of the monetary transmission mechanism, but I'm not sure how seriously I should take them. And I can think of other models that might have other implications. And until we really have the empirical evidence to kind of discriminate among competing explanations, we have to leave them alternative possibilities on the table. And we have to use models in sensible ways that recognize their limits as well as what they can, as well as the clarity they add. And we can recognize that they're wrong, and we have to always have our eyes open to the fact that are they wrong in crucial ways that affect these the policy conclusions. So if you write down this complicated, this model, it's elaborate, it's got this wonderful mathematical structure, you work out the optimal policy that comes out of it, there's a danger if you take that too seriously and don't acknowledge the fact that the model has limitations that you might lead to bad policy analysis. And I'm sorry, to a bad policy implementation.
Yeah, so that was, you're talking about Friedman in the 1960s. In 1974, Hayek wins the Nobel Prize, and his Nobel address is The Pretense of Knowledge, which basically says that attempts to model the economy and the macroeconomy are faux science. They're scientism. They give the illusion of science. And now we come to 2014, so we're half a century after Friedman's early thoughts on this. We have John Taylor at Stanford who talks about the value of rules over discretion. We've had 50 years of data, 50 years of econometric sophistication and improvement. Have we gotten any better? Is there any evidence that Friedman's rules should be replaced by something more sophisticated?
So yes. I think
you're not even going to give me a maybe.
So our learning, it's the case in questions like this that our learning sometimes goes quite slowly, and it doesn't. Our advance of knowledge is sometimes sluggish, but I think we've learned a lot about the potential alternative sources of monetary transmission mechanisms. I think we've learned a lot about better implementations of monetary policy in kind of normal times. It is the case, and there's lots of people out there that say that they predicted the financial crisis. My question to them is, did they really predict the quantitative impact of the financial crisis? I mean, lots of people said, well, the housing market might crash and that could have ramifications and the like. But I think what caught really people lots by surprise is the whole magnitude of the responses as well. That's new data. That exposed gaps in models we had, and it exposed gaps of models being used in monetary policy, because at that point in time, a lot of the macro models had a fairly passive financial sector inside the models. And now we're trying to rethink all the models to say, well, maybe this is far too passive, and maybe this interplay between what goes on in financial markets and the macroeconomy needs to be thought about much more carefully. And we need to think about when can financial regulation lead to harmful effects versus when does this seem to be necessary. So I do think that we've learned stuff, and I think we're going to learn stuff learning more. We're going to learn more coming out of this financial crisis, but we've got a long ways to go.
But it does raise the possibility that new data don't help us improve the model. It's just a different model, right, that we need to be thinking about. So you think about the recovery from the financial crisis, which has been disappointing. I don't think any economists really predicted that magnitude or understood it. Most of the former predictions were wrong. And I've become somewhat skeptical. Okay, I'm being polite. I've become very skeptical of our ability to quantify those things. In fact, I want to suggest, I'm not going to challenge Lord Kelvin. I think the question is whether economics is a scientific enterprise. Would we not be better off treating it more like history? Nobody pretends to quantify the relative importance of the causes of World War I, of which there are 50. We will have many causes of this financial crisis. Some of them are more plausible than others. Certainly, evidence will matter. But the idea that we could treat the economy with any precision seems unlikely to me. So I'm going to stick with Hayek 74. Do you want to disagree?
Do you want me to disagree with you and Hayek, or
or not? You could agree; it'd be great. But I doubt you will.
Let me talk about Hayek.
Yeah,
Hayek 74 is fascinating reading. I sometimes when I give talks these days, I lift a quote out of his Nobel address, and it's very interesting in that Nobel address. He says he's not against using mathematics, but really the type of we really ought to think about economics and even the use of mathematics as providing clarity and leading to more qualitative modeling, and that the quantitative part is something that he doesn't take, that he challenges as possible. Now, I don't take that extreme of a view. I think the part of the Hayek essay that's interesting is the fact that, overconfidence, the statements of the potentially harmful effects of overconfidence in quantitative modeling, and I'm completely on board on that. But to me, we need models to help us understand systematically when evidence is more informative and when it's less informative. We need, and just because there's lots of uncertainty out there doesn't mean that models can't be a useful guide. So I want to incorporate uncertainties inside models in credible ways, and that's what I view as the productive step forward. I think it's useful. It's important both in terms of how we use evidence to understand better the economic system, and I think it's also potentially valuable as a guide in policy, provided that we use it in sensible ways. So I guess I will be disagreeing with both of you on that front.
That's fine. Let me take you to a sort of micro area of those ideas. An issue I talk about sometimes, find myself arguing with friends about, would be, let's say you're in a financial firm like Goldman Sachs, and it's 2005. You're at Bear Stearns, you're at Lehman Brothers, and your risk people are using a model called value at risk, which is an attempt to try to figure out how systemic the risk is within your firm. How is it? How likely is it? What's the probability that your portfolio could have a really bad day and have a catastrophic impact? And that's a very challenging thing to quantify, and there have been a lot of advances in trying to quantify that. And one of them that people use is called value at risk. And it strikes me that having that tool in your hands maybe would work fine, because you're very aware of the dangers. You're very skeptical about, as you've said a few times already, about the tendency toward overconfidence. But most human beings seem to struggle with that, and it raises the possibility, and Nassim Taleb has been an advocate of this view, that actually you're so prone to fooling yourself on this that you're better off not using it at all. Talk about that psychological phenomenon for both. I'm giving an example of a financial firm, but it's obviously a problem for policymakers as well.
So let me talk about the policymaker side of this first. There is a danger, I think, that I think this is relevant for the political economy, that politicians like to embrace economists who express their views with incredible confidence. And
very well said.
That can be problematic. That can be problematic because in a lot of cases that confidence is not real or shouldn't be real. And it's not premised on solid evidence or necessarily solid analysis. It is opinion. It can be stated it could be stated with great confidence, but if it's opinion, it's also good to ask are other opinions what other opinions are consistent with the data and what are their ramifications. So I do think that there is a danger in having false confidence, and I think it can be very present and it's very evident in the policy arena. There's some other wonderful quotes from Milton Friedman on this topic. There's some great quotes in this Hayek essay, which you make reference to on this topic, which I'm sympathetic with respect to. The tool value at risk is interesting in the sense of it's going really in places in which statisticians know are very, very challenging. So value at risk is looking at what people call the tails of distributions, and the tails of distributions are places in which the amount of empirical evidence we have is often fairly thin and sparse. And the value at risk models that a value at risk model can work very, very well through normal times, and then all of a sudden just completely miss.
Which is when you need it.
Because what it does, just because if you have too much confidence in how it's working through normal times, then those are the situations in which you can potentially be burned. So you really, when you study these kind of low frequency tail events, I agree that you need to do some type of robustness analysis. You can't just simply embrace a value at risk model based on one distribution really really have full confidence and have full confidence in the outcomes coming out of it. So again, my view is I don't want to throw away models of tail risk, but I want to attach with those models the appropriate degree of uncertainty. And also to engage in some form of kind of robustness analysis. Suppose that it wasn't quite this, it was that the distribution's off in this particular way. What are the consequences of that?
And so my claim is that that's hard to do in certain environments. And as a result, the counterpoint when I say, well, we shouldn't use models like that are so dangerous because it's hard to remember to do the robustness checks and all that. The counterpoint is, well, what are we going to do? What's the alternative? And the alternative is to operate in a world where you know that your knowledge is very poor. And again, people made investments. I think of history. People made assessments about history without quantitative knowledge. They did the best they could. It's possible that if you're in a financial setting where you have to take risks, you're better off not quantifying them because that fools you into thinking that it's safer than it is.
Yeah, I think throwing away quantification completely is to me, I think it's far too extreme and leads you to a very it's almost throwing out a useful framework for decision making. So on that, I guess I'm on a different view. I really do believe that any type of sensible management of firms or anything, it has to involve some type of quantitative analysis. And I think the real challenge is to make sure we can do it better and to expand our tools, to expand our thinking, and not to just because these are mathematical tools that look very nice, that doesn't necessarily make them right all the time.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I certainly wouldn't suggest we throw out all quantitative methods in any setting, whether it's a firm or a financial firm or a regular firm. But it's interesting. I think it highlights the potential of the focuses on the question, where do you draw the line? When do you start saying this advance may not be an advance? Let's back up for a sec. Let's talk about risk versus uncertainty, or as you phrase it, and it's often phrased these days, risk versus ambiguity, because we're both really talking about both those concepts in this conversation, and I think it would be useful to highlight the difference.
Yeah. So I like to think about there being three different components to the concept of uncertainty. So I guess the initial distinctions of kind of these, at least two of these components, goes all the way back to Frank Knight, a University of Chicago economist, who was prominent decades ago. And Keynes was also wrestling with these issues to some extent, I suppose. Well, so let me just try to draw the following distinction. So suppose I write down some model, and the model has what economists would call shocks with distributions attached to these shocks and the like. And that's that model, when fully specified, will tell you probabilities of all the future events that are within the domain of the model. So you've got there's uncertainty out there, but it's certainly under which you've got the model just tells you all the probabilities of everything. And so once you got the model, it's done. So I like to think of that as risk. It's like if I fully embrace this model, there's the risk component.
There's a random element to life that we might be able to quantify, but we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't.
Yeah. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I can, with this model, I can tell you the probabilities of what's going to happen tomorrow.
Right. Raining, not raining. Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to think about that as risk. Now, in scientific disciplines, and certainly this is very prominent in economics, and we could talk about other things like climate change as well, but let's talk about economics. There's different models out there. There's even a given model, I might not know all the details of it, the so-called parameters of the model. There may be multiple models out there and the like. So now, for me to to assign probabilities on all these on the future, I have to start saying, well, how much weight do I want to put on this model versus that model, each distinct model and the like. So there's this issue about how I want to weight, how much confidence I put in the different models out there. And if, once I make a specification of that confidence, then I can also continue to assign probabilities to things. That process of assigning probabilities across models, I think I think of that as a potential source of ambiguity. I'm not really sure how to do that, and how do I confront that component of uncertainty? There's a third component that I think is probably the hardest part, but I think maybe that in many respects the most important part is all the models are in some sense wrong. How do I use models in sensible ways that in ways that are in some sense robust to different forms of misspecification? I acknowledge that they're wrong, but I don't quite. If I knew exactly how they were wrong, I just fix them, and so I have to somehow confront that form of uncertainty as well. So those are the different pieces that I like to think about when I think about uncertainty.
Yeah, we've really been talking about all three of them, I think, so far.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's go back a little bit in history, because you make reference to a work that was an important part of my graduate school education, which is Burns and Michels' 1946 work on business cycles, which was I went to University of Chicago in the late 70s, and Robert Lucas was my macroeconomics professor, and that was really he was extremely interested in that work. What they did is they tried to give a very thorough picture of how economies move in good times and bad. You reference a review of that work by Alan Koopmans, who won the Nobel Prize, that criticized their work as, quote, measurement without theory. So talk about how this interaction between describing versus understanding, whether it's good to just quantify or whether you need more than just the numbers themselves. And I think that's the discussion between Burns and Mitchell and Koopmans.
Right. So I actually think Burns and Mitchell type activities can be very useful. It's just that if you want to do something with them, then you have to put more structure on it. So, suppose you want to go out and say, I'm just going to go collect a bunch of data and just let the data speak. And so while the data once it starts speaking to specific questions, then that requires more structure to it. And so once you want to take it beyond the fact, well, here's some pattern in the data that looks intriguing, Burns and Mitchell were not just doing some massive fishing expedition. They thought it'd be useful to try to get characterizations of what a business cycle was and the like, and so that was and so they obviously had some good intuitive insights in what they were doing. But to take them to the next stage to really understand relevant policies, macroeconomic policy analysis when it came to how they confront business cycles, that requires more. That requires more formal economic analysis, and it requires more, more serious thought about the consequences. So there's another part of this as well. That Burns and Mitchell had fairly ad hoc methods for producing their evidence, which are useful, but it was also challenging to figure out how the quality of the evidence that they were producing. So lots of people after Burns and Mitchell tried to say, well, let's make this a little bit more formal statistically so I can assess the quality of the evidence. And so Burns and Mitchell, got them going, and I think there was some, follow-up work that kind of showed how you can map it into more formal statistical methods. That was also useful because that allows us to make a little bit better assessment on of the quality of the data and the quality of the evidence which they were looking at.
Let me recount a conversation I had with an applied economist on this issue of measurement and theory, and get your reaction. He had found that when Walmart's come to a city, it drives wages down. But he found that only to be true in large cities. And I found that extremely surprising and counterintuitive, and I thought wrong. And I said, well, how do you reconcile the fact that in large cities there's less competition, there's more competition presumably, and Walmart adding to the demand for workers should push wages up, not down, if at all. It's certainly not down, though. And his response is, well, I'm not handicapped by any particular theory of the labor market. He said you're handicapped by a neoclassical model of labor markets. I just let the data speak. What do you think of that approach?
So I think in this case, I'm with you in the sense of if I've got this empirical evidence and it looks anomalous, I want to go out and understand it. And I want to understand it from the guise of what I think of as a economic model that puts on place some incentives that I expect to be out there, and the role of markets and market interactions. And when I do that, it may well lead me to think about other things going on that would help to explain this evidence. So the first part of my career, I'm spending a lot of time kind of documenting puzzles in asset markets, kind of trying to connect the macroeconomy to the asset markets. And those are, there were like dramatic puzzles out there, and they led to say, well, maybe I have to think about things differently as a consequence. And I guess I would put this in that same category. I'm not going to throw out economics. I'm going to say, well, this is a bit of a disconnect, and I got to think hard about how to close that disconnect, because I don't have a good, coherent theoretical explanation for things, and I just don't know how to use the evidence.
Yeah, his view is that not only you don't have that theory, it's wrong. It's better to not have any theory, because then the data just speak for themselves. And,
if the theory is wrong, let's kind of figure out in ways it's wrong that are also convincing and consistent with other evidence.
Yeah, I think that's the right question. Of course, the other point is that you can spend a lot of time fishing and find a lot of things that may be fish or not, but you can be fooled into thinking you're fish. You have a lot of choices when you do those kind of empirical analyses about what to include and not to include. So you said every model is wrong. Certainly every conjecture about a fact is also often wrong without other clarifying evidence or understanding. So coming back to the Kelvin quote, you have a rather remarkable bit of economic history that I wasn't aware of. Kelvin arguing that it's important to quantify our knowledge. Talk about what Knight and Weiner's perspective to early 20th century, first half of the 20s and 30s at the University of Chicago. How did they respond to Lord Kelvin's insight?
Well, apparently there's this fascinating work that was done by my colleague Stephen Stigler, detective work, along with some other people. This was that quote when it went on the social science building had some controversy attached to it, and Weiner has this, which I quote in my essay. I don't have the exact words now, but basically, even if you can express something in numbers and quantitatively, our knowledge may be meager. So it's kind of like, just because you show me some numbers, that doesn't mean that our knowledge has suddenly become firm and the like. And so I think it was more of a reminder that that economic evidence is sometimes challenging to make it fully persuasive, and that we have to accept the fact that we may be learning slowly, or that our knowledge base is relatively limited when we're looking at direct evidence on behavior.
I have the quote here actually. Knight said in response, "If you cannot measure a thing, go ahead and measure it anyway." And Weiner was even when we can measure a thing, our knowledge will be meager and unsatisfactory. So they were a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, so Knight was kind of just poking fun of the measurement exercise, so the measurement enterprise, I guess, in some sense. I view Knight as more flippant.
Yep, I agree.
And the Weiner one is just reminding us of the don't overplay this. Don't overplay this process in the sense of we should acknowledge the fact that there's bigger character of things, and just making things quantitative doesn't address that fully, or even partially, I suppose.
And then you have a rather remarkable insight about Lord Kelvin and the Age of the Sun. Talk about that.
Yes.
Extraordinary.
So Lord Kelvin, so Lord Kelvin was in this debate with Darwin. He was challenging Darwin's theory of evolution based on his own calculations, and he ended up missing and so he produced his own models, and he basically announced, look, Darwin's calculations can't be right because of just through the guise of his own models. And then it turns out a key energy source was missing from his models, and his models actually had a mistake or a flaw or a gap in them that was critical to trying to assess the insights of Darwin.
Well,
by less order of magnitude.
Yeah, well, his calculation of the age of the sun was 20 million years old, I think is what you wrote. Is that right?
That could be. I don't have it right here, but yeah.
Well, I think the upper bound, I remember, the upper bound was 100 million, and there was a worry that wouldn't give enough time for evolution to take place, which is, it's slightly off, that 100 million, it appears.
Right. Yes. Way off, yes. Yes. Yes, Darwin's in this case, Kelvin's own calculations were way far off given his models. So this is a case where perhaps he had too much confidence in his own models.
But I think the difference potentially is that at least I think we have more confidence that the sun is billions of years old than Kelvin could have had, and it being, say, tens of millions. I think that's true. Of course, there's no way of really knowing, right? There's no way of really verifying whether we have a more accurate age of the sun. But given current scientific knowledge, it appears that the sun is billions of years old, not tens of millions. I worry that economics isn't like that. Can you list some areas where you feel we've improved our precision in anything remotely like that? Finance might be one of them, by the way.
So finance's successes. The challenges in finance are connected to basic economics. Except the principle of no arbitrage or something, I suppose. It's but by itself doesn't have a huge amount of content. The challenge in the finance, for me anyway, has been to try to understand the actual patterns in the data through fully specified economic models. We can do it through more general. The question is what makes things like financial markets fluctuate over time? What makes markets look more risk averse some periods than other periods, and the like. And so we have lots of, I think, a huge amount of systematic evidence on the patterns out there. And some of them are flimsy, but some of them are fairly robust. I mean, the kind of wizard at doing high quality empirical analyses in finance is Gene Fama. So when Gene reports stuff, it seems to be reliable and robust. So I think we have a fair amount of knowledge out there. The challenge for me anyway right now is exactly how do we build the more fully specified models consistent with that evidence. But I think putting that evidence out there in ways that are interpretable, that has the potential to links to models, has been very valuable. And I think it's going to help us think better about modeling going forward.
Do you think we're going to get better and better at finance as well as macro generally? Or do you think that the likelihood of those improvements is better in one field versus the other?
So one can argue that the evidence that we have coming out of financial markets is richer, and but the evidence that's really pertinent to understanding how the economy works is not. I mean, financial markets are forward-looking, and so they're telling us they're giving us some evidence of how people think, but then but that also interplays with how they confront risk and uncertainty and the like. So the forward-looking nature makes them intriguing, but on the other hand, it's to actually fully process that requires some other components of the model that we're still trying to sort out. There are very, very rich sets coming out of finance. The question is how much of that richness is directly usable to understanding the underlying basics of the say macroeconomy, and there it becomes much more limited. But I do think we know today models, much more about which models explain what type of evidence and which ones don't, and where the challenges are. I do think we've made advances there. Do we have a full, complete understanding of the empirical evidence? Absolutely not.
And yet, a lot of people claim that by the early 1990s, say, fiscal policy was widely understood to be unimportant, irrelevant, a thin reed you couldn't really lean on, and not important for guiding the economy. All of a sudden, it's back. I think for not very scientific reasons. It makes one worry that there are fads in economics unrelated to scientific progress, say akin to the age of the sun or the universe. What do you think of that?
there's two parts of this. What do I think about fiscal policy, and the other is what I think about fads. So let me address the issue of fads. There are research fads in a sense of, well, there's the hot topic syndrome, right? So I often, sometimes my own discipline gets embroiled in these like citation counts and the like, and that can be, that I'm often skeptical about, even though I've had some papers that have been highly cited, because
those are the good ones.
A lot of that evidence, a lot of them, is hot topic chasing. So if you write a paper on the topic du jour, then you kind of everyone jumps in and they all cite each other, but then you have to ask, where's this literature 5, 6, and 7 or 8 years later? How much staying power or durability does it have? And I think that's the more interesting question. But there are indeed research fads. I mean, people are all the time looking for what topics to work on. There's graduate students writing dissertations, young scholars working to get their careers off the ground. How do I make big splashes? And there's the hot topic chasing takes place, and some of those hot topics end up becoming important topics, and many fade. So I'm certainly so I do think there's an element of fads that takes place in economic research, and it takes time to kind of for the fads to die out.
Did you want to say anything about fiscal policy? Yeah.
Yeah, so the fiscal policy certainly as it implemented, it's conceived of or implemented. There was no obviously big gains to be had there, and I personally think that for really going forward that fiscal challenges, long-term fiscal challenges, are contributing to uncertainty in ways which we ought to be addressing. There's always this notion that, well, let's go and do a bunch of fiscal stimulus now and worry about long-term budgetary consequences later. And there's this other component to that is the fact that I think this is like a quote of Milton Friedman's or somebody's that there's nothing more durable than a short-term increase in a government program. Or it's once you start these things, they're hard to stop. I actually would have thought, or at least to me, a more sensible approach to thinking about fiscal stimulus would have been the following. Suppose the government has in place a set of projects that are infrastructure projects that they can done cost benefit analysis, and they think that they're really important to be done eventually. There's some flexibility of the timing and the like. Well, maybe at a time of a macroeconomic downturn, there's enough that's a good time to actually be making these infrastructure investments. Maybe labor costs are down and the like, and then do sensible things. Now this is premised on the fact that a government would have had in place so-called shovel-ready projects that they can document of great importance, and then shift the timing. Now that's a different type of perspective than people pushing for standard fiscal stimulus. So let's just get the economy going by putting money out there, and that lever, I agree, can be quite flimsy.
Well, I think their view is that in times when interest rates are close to zero and the economy is struggling, all infrastructure projects have a positive cost-benefit analysis, that the benefits outweigh the cost. I've heard Joe Stiglitz. I've heard Stiglitz say that. I've heard Kirkman say it.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. That's their view. So that part of fiscal stimulus would not be my view. Absolutely.
And how would we know? They're smart. You're smart. Both sides are smarter than I am. How do we adjudicate?
It's very interesting. One of the more sensible discussions of this, it was by a person who was a prominent policy role at some point in time, but this person got up there and said, well, we really don't know the impact of fiscal stimulus. It could be there or it's not there. But if we do it, the costs of doing it are not all that high, and the benefits may be there, so therefore we should go ahead and do it. It was the one person pushing for fiscal stimulus that was doing it based on acknowledging the fact that at least there is some serious uncertainty out there. Now we can debate whether the cost of doing it were really that low or not, and kind of what the likely benefits might be. But I thought it was at least framed in a more sensible way. But you can't. Unfortunately, that's not the way you can influence policymakers if you frame the discussion that way.
Yeah, and the other side, of course, also says that the future costs are very small. So even if maybe the costs are bigger than the benefits, but the costs are so small, they're probably not. And those future expectations about debt and taxes are not important. That's their That's their selling point.
Yeah, no, I'm always nervous when people say, well, let's not worry about budgetary consequences now. We'll just always fix them later, and it's always later. So
it's dangerous.
That view.
That's slightly dangerous. Yeah.
Yes.
Going back, I want to tell a story about. It's interesting that you mentioned Arthur Burns, because my favorite story about systemic risk involves Arthur Burns. George Shultz tells the story. He was head of OMB in the 70s in the Nixon administration, and Penn Central Railroad was going broke. And Arthur Burns, according to Shultz, Arthur Burns, who was the man we mentioned earlier in the Burns and Mitchell business cycle stuff, Burns was saying, we have to bail out Penn Central because there's systemic risk. They're going to fail, and that'll bring down other institutions. And Shultz personally, again, this is his words in his memory, Shultz says, well, I felt really bad disagreeing with Arthur Burns because Arthur Burns is really smart and savvy. And if Arthur Burns says this has systemic risk, it probably does. And they were about to do something when a advisor ran into the room and said, Penn Central's just hired Nixon's old law firm. So for political reasons, we can't touch this with a 10-foot pole. We're going to have to let them sink or swim on their own. So they sunk. They went bankrupt. Nothing happened. The systemic risk wasn't there. And I comment on the political economy of that sort of the downside risk for politicians, whether it's or policymakers, Ben Bernanke being an obvious example, the urge to do something seems very large when you're going to be blamed for the downside if you don't do anything. Yeah.
No, I agree. There's this there is this concern about, you're in the hot seat right now, and it's difficult it's often difficult for them to have all the right incentives for taking long-term considerations. I mean, you don't want to be sitting in the seat and watch things go bad. And so if you can push off the possibilities of bad things into the future, there's a temptation to do that. But let me pick up on another part of your story that I think is quite important as well. Part of coming out of Dodd-Frank is that we now are going to be in this business of designating systemically important financial institutions. And I'm very concerned that this is going to become some type of politicalization. And as soon as these financial firms get designated as being systemically important, associated with that is some type of implicit government guarantees to not let bad things happen to them. And the incentive effects of that look to me to be really quite problematic. And I know some of the systemically important firms that have been declared so far would have much preferred not to have that status, even though there may be some benefits attached to it. And when there's suggestions that firms like Fidelity are going to become systemically important and the like, I get very, very nervous that this designation is going to be applied in very, very broad ways. And part of the ways to get enterprises to behave better is to at least let them to think about the risk of failure, and that can be a very important market disciplining device. So the real challenge is how can we let these financial firms fail without having so much fear attached to that. And I think there's also a concern that if we make this systemically important financial institution designation politicized, and I'm just really concerned about that having bad consequences as well.
Yeah, it seems to me part of the whole notion of systemic risk is trying to map the externality model onto the decisions of private financial firms. The more that we politicize those decisions, the more systemic risk there is, because we've said to them, there is something of a free lunch for you. You will be rescued if you get in trouble, which certainly encourages them to become more interlinked with other firms like themselves to make the probability of being rescued higher. It seems like a very toxic combination.
Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend instead? Do you have any thoughts on what might be a better way to reduce the risk of a 2008 in the future?
So I do think this idea, which I'm no expert in whatsoever, of working out very, very fast and efficient resolutions of financial institutions in ways that we don't have a fear of their consequences. The counterpart to bankruptcy, but done in a super, quick, fast way is quite important going forward.
Of course, one of the problems there is that, again, the firms have an incentive to make it very complicated so that those fast bankruptcies seem unlikely, and therefore they're less likely to be allowed to go bankrupt.
Yeah. So anyway, that's an important challenge, and I think it's kind of a critical one going forward.
Let's go back to economics more generally. You talked about the fad problem and the topic du jour and graduate students doing hopping on whatever's the latest thing. What are the areas that you think, fads or not, that are more enduring? What are the research areas that you find most interesting, as well as ones that aren't going to be for you, but you could recommend to students out there listening or students of economics generally?
Yeah. So I really do think understanding better the connections between financial markets and financial market disruptions in the macroeconomy, building better models, understanding the evidence, which we have better. New evidence is coming. Is now becoming available. I think that's a tremendously fascinating area. I also think of this more general area of the consequences of uncertainty in terms of policy analysis and in terms of even understanding how the economy works. I think we kind of scratched the surface on that one. The so-called risk model, in which kind of lots of these risk effects and economic analyses kind of take on a kind of second-order nature to them, has that's been the past perspective on this, and I think there's some thinking through why uncertainty might be much more of a first order than second order impact in economic analysis, I view as really critical. The part of this that I find challenging is how we get this into more discussions about policy analysis. How do we bring uncertainty to that? And I think it's critical to be done, but that's because of the political incentives and the like, it's very challenging to get it done.
Yeah, as you said, if you're not very confident, you don't tend to get a lot of attention. That's reality.
I guess I can be confident in my lack of confidence, but that doesn't go quite as far.
Yeah, that's my strategy. It limits it limits my audience, but we're doing the best we can.
Yeah.
You referred to this interaction between the financial sector and the macroeconomy. I was struck in the aftermath of the crisis, knowing very little about finance. I know a little bit about macro, but very little. I knew very little about finance, and I realized I had to get a little more educated and understand some of those linkages. And I'm not alone. I think a lot of economists realized they'd specialized in one or the other without thinking about the connections. Is there anybody doing work out there now that you think is promising on that interaction?
I think there's lots of interesting work being done on that now. That there's a little bit of a danger about, well, here's the crisis, we got to rush to quick answers, and there's been a whole variety of different type of modeling approaches to this, all the way from looking formally at network structures and kind of interactions to kind of looking more at in more standard macro models with what happens if financing constraints start binding and the like. Kind of sorting out which of these type of approaches is really going to be the most empirically relevant and the most and the most sensible one for policy analysis is completely wide open right now. So I think our overall, once you attach quantitative ambition to this, it's going to be a while before we're going to have the next kind of really models with more, which I can place more confidence in. But I think there's a lot of really smart young people that are going this area as well. I've been at conferences in which I've watched the job market and there's a rush to do work in this area, and a lot not all of it's good. Some of it's very superficial, but some very smart economic scholars have been drawn into this area, and so I have some optimism there. Yeah,
it's a Nobel Prize out there for folks, so I assume a lot of people are going to try to grab that, right? There's going to be a big return if you could tell a good story and model that well.
Yeah.
Let's close. You mentioned climate change. Have you thought much about that empirical challenge, which strikes me as a very similar? I've claimed this before. Reminds me a lot of the economics or understanding the economy. There's both risk. There's uncertainty. There is, or I'll say ambiguity, using your word. Have you looked at that? Do you Do you have an opinion on the quality of that work?
So there's a really big challenge here. I've actually been involved in a research venture on campus here that's supposed to. The idea was to bring together climate scientists and economists and try to think about these issues, confronting uncertainty and the like. And there's a whole class of climate models out there that are kind of very, very nonlinear models in which there's of a different type than economists are used to, because they don't really have models of these kind of shocks hitting systems. It's all kind of unknown initial conditions they're very, very complicated models to solve. When solved, they get very rich output, but they're not models that it's really easy for people like me to think about how to quantify the uncertainty coming out of them. And I think that's critical if we want to think about designing economic policy to confront climate change. It may well be that you want to, for instance, it may well be that even with meager knowledge, you want to act now, but rather than wait until our knowledge base increases because the costs are lower now, or maybe you want to wait and learn. I mean, that's a critical trade-off, and it would be great to have ways to quantify that. And so I got drawn into this with that type of ambition. Of course, as is most research, has turned out to be remarkably more difficult than I'd hoped. But I still think there's interesting stuff to be done there.
It reminds me of fiscal policy, right? It's the same issue. We have to act now. We have people who are hungry. People are out of work. There may be some costs, but they're in the future and they're probably small. So better safe than sorry. And it's a question of really trying. You really would want to measure the size of those costs to know whether it's a good policy or not. And we don't seem to have much evidence on it.
Yeah, but so here. I think the best statement is that there could be very big consequences. It's not that we know and so maybe it's sensible to start doing things now, just because of the possibility that there could be very dramatic consequences otherwise. I find that personally of some appeal, but it's would I love to be able to quantify that or make it more of a systematic, formal statement? And the answer is yes, but I don't know how to do it yet.
Let's close with a personal note, if you want to share it. Winning a Nobel Prize is kind of a life-changing event, no doubt. Going forward, what do you see as your research agenda, and how much of that's been affected by winning the Nobel Prize?
Yeah. So I've actually been wrestling with this question for the last, when I've had my limited free time on the last few months.
It's a big distraction.
It's so. The thing that is the case is the fact that because the Nobel Prize, you're suddenly given more attention. I tell people, well, I'm the same person I was 8 months ago, but somehow you're treated differently, as if your IQ just jumped by 40 points or something. But anyway, so that experience is kind of interesting along some dimensions. Suddenly, I go to like these public events, and now people want to talk to me, whereas before they were happy to ignore me, and that's like okay. But I think there's an opportunity out there. I've been very, very lucky over the years having some great graduate students just in advance of me going to Stockholm, they threw a conference in my honor, and I've had about 60 that I was a formal advisor of, and well over 100 and some that I've been on committees of. And just seeing them out there doing a whole variety of important, interesting research is really very gratifying. So what I would really like to do is, whatever attention I have going forward, is to try to draw attention, to try to encourage and nurture young scholars and in fields that are of great interest to me. So if I can help to become, not only to continue to make my own advances, but help to become a more effective advocate for lines of research, then I think that's probably the best I can do.
Well, I suspect some of them are listening. My guest today has been Lars Peter Hansen. Lars, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Sure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.